The Straw King, Chapter 7. The Scarecrow had never visited his old friend's new home, and despite the circumstances, he looked around in wonder. From a distance, the forest boundaries was so pronounced it looked like a giant green wall looming over the landscape. A golden meadow grass, gently weaving in the breeze, ran straight up to the forest edge and stopped abruptly. Golden jewel flies buzzed in the tall grass and were snapped up by emerald green belly frogs that burped tiny puffs of pink smoke after their meal. Flat sapphire pools glinted here and there, but when the Scarecrow stopped down to touch the fresh-looking water, his fingers flicked against diamond and hard gemstone. It was beautiful, but he could never live like this. Where would all his books go? As soon as they set foot inside the forest barrier, the sunlight vanished, as if someone had thrown a light switch. The forest of the beasts was eerily quiet, as if the lion's subjects somehow already sensed that trouble was brewing. The Scarecrow rubbed his button eyes, squinting in the sudden dimness. Lion was nocturnal, so he was used to the dark, but the Scarecrow hesitated. The lion looked back with a sigh, then looped his tail around Scarecrow's waist, guiding him. All around them the towering brown trunks rose into a shadowy forest canopy, and the silence of the forest was as thick as a blanket. The lion rose up on his hind legs, leaning his paws against the nearest tree. It made a sound somewhere between a cough and a roar. Out of nowhere, a large rabbit scampered up to them. He was wearing a neatly cut velvet suit, and a tiny top hat was tilted in a rakish angle over one of his ears. His buck teeth protruded at a slightly ridiculous angle. "Your Majesty!" the rabbit cried, clapping his paws together. "We've been so anxious to have you back." The rabbit caught sight of the Scarecrow, and a startled expression passed across his face. "I beg your pardon, Your Majesty," he said, executing a sweeping bow. "I didn't see that the King of Oz was with you." He bowed again, this time at the Scarecrow. "It's all right," the Scarecrow said, in a way he hoped was regal. "Can't we have some light, Cornelius?" the lion rumbled, and the rabbit clapped his paws together again. "His Majesty will fire me for my foolishness," he exclaimed to the trees. He ran back and forth in agitation, pawing frantically at his top hat. The lion sighed and dropped to all fours, settling back on his haunches and opening his mouth in a huge yawning roar. "Lights!" he bellowed. As if by magic, a storm of tiny lights swirled up out of the earth, spinning around them. Each one of them was a tiny firefly that buzzed upward, landing in a tree and branches until they were thickly covered in growing light. A small army of badgers, foxes, and weasels carrying stringed instruments rushed in after the fireflies, assembling themselves in an unruly group in front of the lion and the Scarecrow, and striking up a slightly out-of-tune march. Cornelius pronounced a golden banner depicting the lion from behind a tree and waved it back and forth. "His Majesty has returned to the Forest of the Beasts," he bellowed. The Scarecrow heard cheering from the depths of the forest, and soon more and more animals poured into the clearing where they stood, jostling one another as they tried to get closer to the lion. Cornelius rudely pushed aside a bear cub, a crocodile with rows and rows of jagged teeth, and several rats. "Clear a path for His Majesty," he shouted pompously. The animals ignored him, and he shoved them more aggressively until finally they moved aside. The lion walked forward, and the Scarecrow followed him through the forest. It was difficult for the Scarecrow to make his way through the woods. The animals surged around him, and sometimes underfoot, nearly tripping him. The trees grew densely together, and while the lion wove around them with ease, the Scarecrow had to pick his way. His clothes caught in the underbrush, and branches hit him in the face. "I'm a long way from the palace," he thought, and he didn't realize he'd spoken aloud until the lion laughed. "It's not the luxury you're used to," he agreed. The Scarecrow resented the implication that he'd gotten soft, but that he said nothing. The lion would see soon how tough he could be when they found a way to regain his throne and restore order to Oz. No one would doubt him then. At last they reached another clearing, this one much bigger than the one they had met Cornelius. Animal skins were rigged overhead in a network of ropes and pulleys, forming a kind of canopy. At one end of the clearing was a lopsided structure that looked like a rickety giant wooden jungle gym, with more animal skins piled on various wooden platforms and ledges. The lion leapt up to it, and the whole arrangement creaked and wobbled. The lion yawned as his subjects flooded into the clearing. "Home at last," he sighed in satisfaction. I'll need something to eat. He looked poignantly downward, and several badgers seized a young deer who was staring obliviously in the other direction. It struggled briefly, but the badgers subdued it and dragged it up to the lion's platform. The lion licked his lips happily, and the scarecrow looked away in horror as he dove into his snack. The lion had said he'd never kill anyone before, but apparently that didn't extend to animals. It's part of the job, someone said at his side, and he looked down to see Cornelius. Eating your subjects? The scarecrow said, aghast. Cornelius shrugged. He's a lion. It's his nature. He doesn't mean to be cruel. He's doing it to survive. Killing for sport is something only humans do. The rules are different here, Your Majesty. We all understand the law of the forest. When the lion was finished eating, he belched loudly, and a hush fell across the clearing. He turned his gaze to the scarecrow. Now we must decide what to do about the throne, he said. News had traveled fast, the scarecrow realized. The gathered animals began to shout out suggestions. Eat the impostor, shrieked a bobcat. Bury her in a burrow, yelled a fox. Chew off her toes, squeaked a mouse. The scarecrow almost groaned aloud. He could just picture the lion's menagerie clearing the palace and falling dead within seconds to Ginger's bullets. They were no match for her. At least not without a good plan. I need my books, lion, he said suddenly. He'd find the perfect strategy in one of those volumes, he just knew it. A silence fell over the animals, and then the scarecrow heard what could only be described as a giggle that quickly turned into a roar of laughter. Leave us, all of you, the lion growled. This is a matter for the scarecrow and I to decide. Cornelius, bring me Lulu. Lulu will know what to do, yelled a dormouse excitedly, before one of its companions hushed it. Who's Lulu? The scarecrow choked out, sure that the fabric of his face was on fire. Help, the lion glanced at him, and raised a bushy eyebrow. And maybe don't mention the B word again, if you want the beast to take you seriously. We're not big readers in the forest. The scarecrow nodded. He wasn't in the palace anymore. I wouldn't mind dessert, the lion mused, and the rest of the animals fled.